There are lots and lots of ways to move things around a web page or app with CSS. We've covered styling and how the elements work with boxes. This is a good place to start, but now we need to move them. Floats is the oldest method and was never originally meant for layout. As with all original CSS, it has ties to documents. If you consider a Word document, for instance, and you want to have a picture in amongst words, you might want to have the words surround the picture. That's what floats were for and are for. Its original intention was to allow content to flow around another element. Let's take a look at the HTML for this page. I have my header, which has the headings and the nav in. There's a main section, which has this article in, which has an image and some text. And then there's an aside underneath, with a little section for related articles. There's also our footer at the bottom. Let's use floats for what they're intended for and get the text in this article to move around the image. To do this, I'm going to use the float property on the image itself. Let's float it right. You can see that the paragraph has surrounded the image. You may not be able to tell here, but what has also happened is the image has come out of the flow of the document. Let's make the paragraph smaller and you'll see what I mean. Let's remove some of this text. The content below the image and the paragraph can't see the image, so as you can see it's moved up below it, just like it normally would with the paragraph there. This can cause somewhat erratic behaviour when working with floats as a layout method, rather than just moving content around something. Let's put our text back in a minute. There is a fix for this, but before we take a look at it, let's revise our values for floats and look at another example. We've used float right on the image, and that's moved the image to the right. By default, elements are not floated, and the value there is none. So we can make the image go back to where it was. There is also float left, which will move the image to the left, and the text will sit to the right of it. There's a couple of other values, but let's just stick with these for now. Let's use floats as a layout method and get the aside, which is sitting underneath the main area, to the right of the main area. So here I have my main element in my CSS and my aside element in my CSS. The main element has a pink border and the aside element has a purple border. Let's float our main element to the left and float our aside element to the right because that's where we want it to be. Now a couple of things have happened. The main area is floated left, but the content inside it is taking up 100% of the width, so we can't really see that it's gone left. The aside area has floated to the right. Its content doesn't take up 100% of the width, so it's just taking up the width of its content. The other thing that's happened is because they're floated, they're now not in the flow of the document. So this footer is moved up to the available space that it has. We'll talk about the footer in a minute, but let's make sure there's enough room for the aside to sit on the right of the article. Let's add a width to the main area and a width to the aside area that's less than 100%, which should allow for enough space for both of them to sit side by side. Not quite. Do you remember when we were adding padding to our widths previously and it added it to whatever measurement we had for the width? This is what's happening here. There's still not quite enough room. This is a common mistake when we try to get boxes next to each other with floats. We've got 66% width and 33% width which should be enough room in 100% width for both of these things to sit side by side. But because we have padding on both of these areas, they're added to the width as well. So it all comes in at over 100%. Do you remember our box sizing property? And changing it to border box means that the padding will be included in the width. Let's do that. Great. Now the padding is getting included in the width of 66% and 33%. So there's now enough room for both of these to sit side by side. Now all we have to do is deal with this footer. Because both the main element and the aside element have jumped out of the normal flow of the document, which, if we remember our display types, block would take up the entire width and sit on top of each other, the footer has jumped up and is now sitting in the available space. Remember that we floated our main left, and all the content underneath it is going to try and float around this element. What we can do is we can create an element that sits around both the main element and the aside element. And that should contain our floats, meaning that the footer can now sit underneath. Remember our little tip about writing a comment at the end of a div which encapsulates a lot of things, so remember which one it is. If I put a class of container on this div, in this comment I can say it's the closing tag for container. Still not quite. That's because we want to tell this div that the main and the aside are in it. Remember, they're not in normal flow of the document. There's a couple of ways of doing this. Let's add our .container to our CSS. The legacy way to do this is to add an overflow property. And this is to the parent. This now means that the container sees both the main and the aside and makes the footer sit underneath it. There's a couple of problems with this, however, as this is not what that property is meant for. The overflow property is used in sectioning elements to display scroll bars. So normally you'd have overflow scroll. We're just using it so the container can see both of these elements. Because this is not what that property is intended for, on a few occasions you might experience some erratic behavior. However, the overflow property is well supported. There is a new property, which is display flow root, which essentially does the same thing. It tells the parent element, our container, what is inside it. It contains this main and this aside. There are some older browsers, like Internet Explorer, that don't support the flow root value of the display property. But for the purposes of our examples, this is fine. So let's use that one. Now our footer is at the bottom of the page again, and we've managed to move the boxes left and right. Something to note here is that we've actually floated the main to the left and the aside to the right. We could have floated them both left. This is because the sidebar would float up to the left side of the main section. So either could be used here. Because floats can move boxes next to each other, you might think it's a good idea to use it to get these nav elements next to each other. So we have a horizontal nav. Let's take all the LIs in our nav and float them right. So they all move to the right of our header and hopefully next to each other. This has caused another couple of problems again. Our container div wants to move up next to our floated right element. So let's use our display flow route property on the header, which is our container for our nav. Now our container div can sit underneath the header. The other thing that you might have noticed by floating all our list items to the right is that they've changed order. So they are sitting next to each other, and we can style them so they look better. But instead of saying home about contact, they now say contact about home. This is because the first element was floated right, and then the second element went next to that, and the third element went next to that. So maybe this isn't the right method for our links. One thing about CSS layout methods is there are quite a few of them, and it's just experience from practice which allows us to choose the best one. Do you remember our display types? We could just harness them. If we give the li elements a display type of inline block, they'd be displayed in line, so all next to each other, but act like boxes. Now we still have to do some work if we actually wanted them to the right, but they are in the right order. Let's float the nav to the right. Now that our li elements are displayed inline block, they're in a line next to each other, and they also act like block elements. So just like boxes, we can add margin and padding and they'll work nicely. However, when we come to put a gap in between them, things start to get a little bit fiddly. We might want to have them flush up against the right side, but with an even gap in between each element. There is a way to do this. It's in the next layout method. So let's move on and take a look at it.